Hi everybody. Today we're going to be focusing on the urinary system. We'll look at some of the main functions of this system and look at some of the general gross and microscopic anatomy associated with the kidney and the system as a whole. So some of the main functions of the kidney include maintaining the chemical consistency of the blood. When we talk about chemical consistency, some of the things that we're focusing on is going to be the ions, which include calcium, sodium. So ions, when we're talking about the first point, we're talking about calcium, chloride, potassium, sodium. These are the main ions that you can basically balance if you have too much of it, and if you need to store those extra ions, then your urinary system can reabsorb them and return them back to your blood for basically the use by your cells. It also has the responsibility of filtering many of the body fluid coming from your bloodstream. We'll discuss about the numbers and what actually can get filtered as we go through the lectures. We also have the ability to remove the metabolic waste from our body as well as excess water. So when we talk about metabolic waste, the main ones that are discussed is urea, uric acid, and creatinine. Urea and uric acids are both as a result of or associated with muscle, or you can say most specifically protein breakdown. And uric acid is a destruction or basically a waste product as a result of metabolism of nucleic acids. So these are the main three waste products that are basically being processed and continue to be processed throughout your body and being removed and excreted using your urinary system. Another function that we will talk about later on in much more detail is the function or the role that urinary system has in maintaining pH. So maintaining pH has to do with basically balancing your hydrogen ion and your bicarbonate. So again, I will spend a lot of time on this, but if you guys remember from our previous lectures, your blood pH is a magic number between 7.35 to 7.45. So if you have fluctuation either below or above this number, urinary system is one of the systems that will help significantly to maintain that level. So moving on from the main functions of the kidney or urinary system as a whole, there are four main organs that are associated with the system, which is relatively simple compared to what we've discussed. So kidneys, we all know that we have two kidneys, one on the right, one on the left. We'll talk about them in a bit. Ureters, which will be described as the tubes that go from the kidney down to the urinary bladder, with the goal of basically transporting the produced urine by kidneys to the urinary bladder. The bladder is going to be used as a storage resource, and eventually urine can be excreted using urethra. Something to note that the urethra between male and female would be different as far as the size and either dual functionality or single functionality. So something to keep in mind as we go through this PowerPoint. So here is the picture of the urinary system. You have your kidneys. You have a right kidney and a left kidney. These yellow tubes that are coming down would be identified as your ureters. You have the urinary bladder. So in women, you notice that uterus, which is basically the womb, sits right above the urinary bladder. And the tube that is opening up to the outside would be known as urethra. Now, something to note in this picture is that the right kidney, by looking at it, the right kidney sits slightly below than the left kidney. So here is the right kidney. So if you draw a right straight line, you see that the right is slightly below the left. The reason for that is because you have this this really large organ, which is your liver, located right about here. So basically that causes the right kidney to be slightly below the left kidney. If you look at it in a sense of protection, your kidney is partially protected by your rib cage. So these are your floating ribs right here. You see, this is your rib 12. You see majority of the kidneys are protected. However, they are partially out and are protected by the muscular tissue that forms the posterior lumbar region of the body. You also have a region referred to as hilus or hilum. I'll talk about that in more detail, but if you're looking at the whole picture of the kidney, this kind of a middle region where you have that kind of an indentation, that's the region we refer to it as renal hilus or hilum, and that is where all the main blood vessels and nerves either enter or exit the kidney. Last thing we need to know about the kidney is if you look at it up close, you see that there is a fibrous, a kind of that darker brown layer that is surrounding the kidney, and it actually has a protective function to it, and we refer to this as fibrous capsule. Do remember that anytime I mention the word fibrous, it implies that it has a protective role into it. Now, continuing with the anatomy of the kidney, we're going to start by looking at the gross anatomy of the kidney. So I'm going to do some of the labeling and just kind of showing you what these are. So anytime you hear the word cortex, cortex is referring to the more superficial aspect of the kidney. So what you see here going around in the lighter shade of pink, this whole section going around will be identified as renal cortex. Now what you also see is you see these triangular structures that is more inside the kidney. Each of these are referred to as the renal pyramids. Renal pyramids. Renal implies kidneys. However, if I put all of the renal pyramids together, I form this inner aspect of the kidney where I'm running my cursor over. This would be referred to as the renal medulla, which simply put is the inner aspect of the kidney, versus renal cortex would be the outer aspect of the kidney. Now you also see there are extensions of the cortex that goes between each of these pyramids, so the areas that I'm drawing, these would be referred to as the renal column. So it's basically columns that are formed between the pyramids. Now, the main function of the kidney is to produce urine. So that urine that's being produced by the microscopic structure eventually needs to be picked up, basically streamed to larger and larger tubules and be collected eventually by the tube that exits the kidney, which we refer to as ureter. So what does that process looks like? Or what is the path of urine as it starts to come out of the kidney? So you start to see these regions right here, which is basically the end of the renal pyramids, which are referred to as the renal papilla. Then they open up to these tiny or smaller branches you see right here, and right here. These smaller branches is referred to as minor calyx. And you can see that these minor calyx, one right here, one right here, one right here, are merging together to form this larger section right here, which we're going to refer to as the major calyx. So basically, I'm going to start with minor calyces, which is the plural version of the calyx, which empties into major calyces. And then if you follow these, all of these major calyces you see right here empty into this central region right here, which we refer to as renal pelvis. So it continues to the renal pelvis. And if you continue that, it basically comes out of the ureter, which is the tube that we have. So ureter, and following that, that would be basically bladder, and bladder goes to urethra, which basically allows the urine to be excreted. Here's the terminology we already talked about. Renal cortex, medulla, which is the inner aspect. The triangular structures within the renal medulla are renal pyramids. Renal columns are the extensions of the cortex between the renal pyramids. Minor and major calyces are parts that collect urine from each pyramid. Renal pelvis is basically where major calyces are emptying into. I just noticed that this is the wrong word, guys. This is supposed to be major calyx, not cortex. So please make that correction in your. This is major calyx. And again, renal pelvis is where all of the major calyces empty into, and then eventually continues as ureter. Hilum is that indentation you see in the middle of the kidney, that where all the blood vessels and the ureter or nerves enter or exit the kidney. The only thing we haven't talked about on that slide is the word nephron. So if I want to simplify the function of nephron in a few words, I can describe it as the basic unit of kidney. Basic unit of kidney implies that it is basically the component that is responsible for producing urine. It is when that urine is being produced by your kidneys, it eventually empties into structures referred to as collecting ducts. So basically you collect urine. And collecting duct also has an ability to help with forming concentrated urine when you are dehydrated. Now, if you look at the structure of a nephron, the most basic way to describe it is nephron is divided to two main structures, renal corpuscle and renal tubules. So tubules, automatically you should think about tubes, right? Corpuscle is a structure that is the main place for the process of filtration to take place. So let's start to unravel the structure of the nephron in the next few slides. So here is a typical picture of a nephron. So let's see if we can identify the structures. So the first thing you notice is there is a circular structure right here. This circular structure as a whole is referred to as the renal corpuscle. Now, what is the renal corpuscle made up of? It is made up of this shell that you see in a yellow color, which is referred to as the glomerular capsule. And what you notice is there seems to be a tuft of capillaries inside this structure, and that is referred to as the glomerulus. So we have glomerulus as the blood capillaries, and you have a protective shell around that, which is referred to as the glomerulus capsule. And both these structures together is referred to as renal corpuscle. Now we also have the renal tubules, right? Basically what you see right here in the central piece. So if you want to kind of think about this, it's relatively easy to remember the name. If I have fluid moving through this tube, it's going to move through this part of the tube first, right? Then it's going to go down. It's going to come up, pass through this bunch of twisted tubes, and eventually empties into this main branch. Now notice earlier I mentioned that the urine empties into the collecting duct. So this last piece that you see right here is a collecting duct. What you see from basically from here to here would be your renal tubules. So what are renal tubules made up of? So the first part of the renal tubules, which is in proximity to your renal corpuscle, is referred to as proximal convoluted tubules. Proximal convoluted tubules, which are usually shorthand to PCT. Then your fluid starts to move down, right? So this part as fluid moves down, we refer to it as what? The descending limb, because fluid is moving downward. You're gonna loop, so basically this is your loop, and then your fluid starts to move upward, so we refer to this as the ascending limb of the nephron loop. You start going up, and then you have a lot of, again, a bunch of convoluted tubules, right? So if these were proximal, as in close, these ones are far, so what do I call them? Distal convoluted tubules, which I can also shorthand to DCT. So if you're looking at the structure of a nephron and breaking it down, renal corpuscle, as I mentioned earlier, basically the circular head. You have the circular head, which is made up of a bunch of capillaries inside, and this is the capillaries that I'm drawing. The capillaries is your what? Glomerulus. And then you have the shell that surrounds that, which is called what? The glomerular capsule, right? It also referred to as the Bowman capsule, something to know. It's the person that discovers it. But we're starting to use the more common terminology, which is the glomerular capsule. Now, if you take a look at the glomerular capsule, like what we talked about, we have two membranes. We have the outer membrane and we have an inner membrane. The outer membrane vocabulary would be parietal, very similar to what we learned about serous membrane. And it is made up of simple squamous epithelium. This is this layer, guys, the red layer that I'm showing you right here. Okay, so this layer, I'm going to draw it like this. This layer that I'm drawing right here, this is part of the glomerular capsule, but which part of it? The parietal, parietal layer of it. So where is the visceral layer? So visceral layer is shown right here. So I'm gonna go back. Sorry, let me go back here. So if you look at this, again, this is your Bowman, this is your renal corpuscle. You see that you have basically the Bowman capsule or the glomerular capsule. So the layer you see right here, see, it's single cells and these are flattened cells. So this would be what? The parietal layer, which is made up of simple squamous epithelium. So I'm going to write it. So this is the parietal layer made up of simple squamous epithelium. And then what you see around your network of capillary, which we identified as glomerulus, is these yellow cells that are kind of look like an alien cells wrapping themselves around the capillaries. These cells are referred to as podocytes, and they form what? They form the visceral layer of the glomerular capsule. So just to kind of review what I'm pointing out to, glomerulus is still glomerulus, right? So glomerulus is going to be basically a collection of capillaries. Sorry, I don't know why it does that. Glomerular capsule, the protective layer, has two layers. Parietal layer, which is the surrounding layer, right? The outer shell. And the inner shell will be your visceral layer made up of cells called podocytes. And please do note that the role of these podocytes, the importance of these podocytes is in filtration. So basically they control what gets filtered and what is not filtered. We already talked about this, but just kind of quickly going over that as a review. Renal tubules, we made the first part of it is PCT, or proximal convoluted tubules. Second part of it is the nephron loop, which is made up of descending limb and the ascending limb. It has been mentioned that it does have thin and thick segments, but it is not necessarily something that you need to know in detail about. The last part of the renal tubules is the distal convoluted tubules, which is also known as DCT. And then whatever urine is being produced by these nephrons eventually empties into the collecting ducts and eventually picks up by the minor calyces. Just a quick note, when you look at the picture that I showed you earlier, notice that in the collecting duct, you have these little tiny branches that are joining the collecting duct. So each of these branches come from one of the nephrons. So if I was labeling this basically in a sense, let's say this is DCT for nephron 1, this is DCT for nephron 2, this is DCT for nephron 3, etc. So you have many nephrons, up to 10, emptying into one collecting duct, and those collecting ducts again empty into a minor calyx. So I'm going to stop the PowerPoint here, and then we'll continue with our next section, which is the blood vessels of the nephron, in our next PowerPoint.